Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to have a look at an exam question on rural geography. And we're going to focus specifically on an answer that relates to a developed country that you have studied. And the question wants you very specifically to target your answer around an example that you will have studied in class relating to a country, and it's relating to recent developments. Now, this is a question it has a lot of similarities to a question where it asks you to discuss in detail two of these specific changes that we can see on this picture. However, if you look closely at this question, first of all, the question isn't actually asking you to refer to one or two, or indeed any of the points made in that photograph. You can choose to do so, but the question is not requiring you to do that. It is an explain question, so you need to give a reason for each of the changes. And it's a development in farming. And specific to this question, you must refer to advantages and disadvantages. And it's a 6-mark question, so a lot of marks for this question. Now, it would be wise to include at least one advantage or one disadvantage in your answer. You do not need an equal balance between the two, but you must have both represented in your answer to guarantee that you're going to get full marks. Okay. The second thing to bear in mind about this question is that you should start off answering with the country that you've studied. Okay, that needs to appear because it is part of the question. So let's have a look at approaching this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the United States, which has had lots of changes. Why the United States? Well, first of all, it's a developed country, so I'm targeting the requirement of the question, and I'm mentioning at the start of my answer in the United States. Now, probably the most common point you want to make is the impact of new technology. So there's a lot of good case studies out there you could refer to, but for example, in California, new technology, for example, tomato harvesters, have been developed at a huge cost to enable farmers to harvest rapidly using modern technology, which limits the amount of workers they need to employ. And therefore, they're able to harvest and sell tomatoes at a price that's competitive on the world market. And that's quite important. The machines in California are not just about making these farmers more money, but they're competing in a globalized economy, in a world economy. And therefore, if they want to sell tomatoes at the same sorts of prices that countries like African countries can sell their tomatoes, who have much cheaper labor costs, they've got to find a way to do that. Okay. So the first example here is the use of large machines, for example, the large tomato harvesters that allow them to reduce their dependency on large workforces. And these machines can cover the ground very quickly. Now, another adaptation that these farmers have made is the use of genetically modified tomatoes. And this is really important for a couple of reasons. First of all, the genetically modified tomatoes can grow using relatively less water than non-genetically modified. And that's quite important in an area like California that has a significantly low level of rainfall. So they're able to grow these crops in relatively dry areas. These crops grow rapidly, so they're able to have more than one harvest in a year. They can have at least 3 or 4 tomato harvests in a year. And most importantly, the genetically modified tomato can actually survive the harvesting process because it's a soft fruit, a tomato, and therefore it needs to be able to, when being picked by a machine, it could actually quite easily get damaged. But the genetically modified tomatoes are able to survive this particular process. Okay, so what we've brought in here is the idea of new technology and genetically modification, and we've linked that to a specific case study. If we take that same case study forward, what we can see a lot of the Californian tomato growers are doing is they are also diversifying. And the way they're doing that is rather than just sell their harvested tomatoes on the world market, what they're doing is they are actually building their own tomato pasting factories, which allows them to process the raw tomatoes into a tomato puree, which they can then sell at a much higher value. So they don't just make profits from selling the tomatoes, which would actually be relatively small profits because just tomato on its own is not worth very much. But by taking it to the next step where they purify it and sell it in liquid form, they actually increase the value of it, and therefore they're making a greater range of profits. So that is allowing you to bring in diversification into your answer. Okay, let's look at some other things that farmers are doing. So, organic farming is common now in the United States, where farmers are increasingly, or some farmers are looking to raise their animals, whether that's cows, pigs, or sheep, in non-factory environments. So, a lot of farming has gone factory-based in the United States, which is leading to a range of environmental problems and diseases in these animals. But by going organic, you get two benefits. The first one is that animal health is substantially improved and the chances of losing large numbers to a disease is reduced. And that therefore can potentially benefit the farmer if there's an outbreak of certain diseases. Second thing, though, is increasingly more and more consumers are looking to buy organically raised chickens, organically raised pigs, or for example, bacon. And that's a key demand of theirs. So whilst the farmer is inevitably going to grow less crop or less animal if it's organic, they benefit because people are willing to pay a higher price for organically raised food because it's in high demand, especially for health reasons. So there's an explanation for the advantages. I built into that, though, a disadvantage of organic farming. One of the problems of organic farming is you become very dependent on nature. And for example, if you're not adding pesticides or fertilizers, it's likely your crops are not going to grow as quickly or as well as they would do if you were adding these artificial chemicals. And that means the crop is likely to be less. So they then become very dependent on the price that they can sell it at. And if I'm not able to sell it at a higher price, they can end up making less money. But on the positive side of organic farming, and this is a new point, an advantage, is that the fact that organic farming is generally much better for the soil. It helps sustain the long-term health of the soil, which means that the soil is not going to need so many inputs in terms of fertilizers in the future, and it's less likely to suffer from erosion. So it benefits the farmer in the long term because a farmer who might farm for 30, 40 years on a piece of land is going to have a quality piece of soil to farm in rather than degrading it by continually having to add chemicals to grow crops. Okay, so that is what we are seeing in terms of organic farming. Right, let's just spin off into some other areas just to pick up a few more points in relation to genetic modification. On a negative side of genetic modification is increasingly there is a backlash amongst consumers who don't want to buy crops that are genetically modified. They're worried that these crops have environmental impacts on the environment that are negative and are harming both the soil but also the biodiversity, the wildlife and the insects, and are therefore less likely to buy it. So farmers who are using this might be growing more, but what they might be finding is it's more difficult to sell their crops at higher prices due to a fall in demand of genetically modified crops. Okay, just going to finish off with new technology. One aspect of new technology that we're seeing in the United States now that goes beyond just having bigger machines is we're now starting to see these machines are actually robotically driven, so and are directed by satellites. So farm sizes have grown massively in America. And because of that, they can be harvested by 10 machines running in a line next to each other. And rather than have 10 drivers driving all these machines, you could, in theory, just have them being driven by satellite. And the satellite can actually, using GPS, steer those 10 machines and turn them when they get to the end of the field and they head back down. So this technology allows them to drive in perfectly straight lines, ensuring the entire crops are harvested effectively, with actually requiring no labor to do that. The downside, a negative of these very large machines, because if you're going to build really large machines, you need really large fields. And the negative side of really large fields is that a lot of hedgerows have been destroyed, which would have been dividing lines between fields. So in the photograph, for example, we can see a hedgerow in the background. Now, why that's a problem is because these hedgerows tend to be habitats for a wide range of insects and wildlife. And the destruction of these hedgerows across the United States has seen a removal of this habitat area for insects and wildlife. And that's because the field sizes have grown. Okay, so I've covered quite a number of almost 4 of these 5 points here, and I've linked it directly to a case study, bringing in some examples with an answer that would easily get you 6 marks because each point was fully explained. Why is it an advantage or why is it a disadvantage?